The brave airmen serving with the 8th Air Force developed a profound and chilling dread of anti-aircraft artillery, or Flak, which surpassed their apprehension of enemy fighter planes. As the summer of 1943 unfolded, German interceptors, though formidable, could often be repelled through the disciplined cohesion of tight bomber formations and the protective presence of accompanying escort fighters. However, the ominous dark convolutions of exploding 88 shells relentlessly pursued these bombers, clinging to them like a malevolent shadow throughout their perilous journeys to the intended targets. The stark and unembellished figures painted a grim reality. Nearly 70% of all B-17 losses sustained over the hostile skies of Germany were attributable to this deadly anti-aircraft fire, rather than the agile Messerschmitts or the robust Focke-Wulfs. Indeed, the crews frequently expressed a preference for confronting a dozen of the formidable Luftwaffe fighters over the harrowing experience of navigating a concentrated flak barrage, such as those encountered over heavily defended industrial strongholds like Schweinfurt or the vast industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley. The sheer lethality of Flak did not merely stem from the colossal volume of projectiles unleashed. Rather, the German war machine had elevated anti-aircraft defense to an exact, albeit terrifying, scientific discipline. Every pivotal industrial complex within the formidable Reich was meticulously encircled by formidable batteries of both 88 mm and 105 mm cannons. Yet, the true destructive power emanated from the intricate, sophisticated system that orchestrated these weapons. German flak crews did not merely discharge their armaments into the expansive sky, relying on mere chance or hopeful speculation. Instead, they employed cutting-edge predictive technologies capable of precisely calculating the future position of an incoming bomber, often 30 seconds in advance. This intricate calculation meticulously factored in the aircraft's current velocity, its precise altitude, and its directional trajectory. Consequently, by the time the bomber reached that predetermined point in the vast expanse of the sky, the shells were already detonating with lethal precision within that exact spatial coordinate. American bomber strategies during the years 1942 and the early part of 1943 inadvertently rendered the task of the German gunners almost deceptively simple. The Army Air Forces had meticulously crafted a doctrine centered on the principle of precision daylight bombing, a tactical approach that necessitated extended, unswerving, and level bombing runs. The highly sensitive Norden bombsight, a marvel of contemporary engineering, absolutely required a stable platform for its optimal operation. Any deviation, however slight, in the final, critical minutes before the release of bombs would irrevocably compromise the accuracy of the entire mission. Consequently, B-17 formations would meticulously stabilize their flight paths approximately 10 to 15 miles from the target, meticulously locking onto their initial point, and then proceed to fly with unwavering linearity at a constant altitude and airspeed. This rigid adherence to course continued until the lead bombardier initiated the release sequence. Every subsequent aircraft within the formation would then precisely follow the trajectory of the lead bomber's ordnance as it plummeted earthward. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. What do you think about the video topic? Where are you from? Those final 3 to 5 minutes before bomb release stretched into an agonizing eternity. Initially, one might observe the nascent flak bursts appearing on the horizon ahead, appearing as small, innocuous black puffs that seemed almost harmless from such a considerable distance. However, as the formation inexorably advanced into this lethal airspace, the aircraft would begin to shudder violently from the concussive force of near misses. Shrapnel, razor-sharp and deadly, would tear through the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage with a sound eerily reminiscent of hailstones furiously pelting a tin roof. Yet, these were no ordinary hailstones. These metallic fragments possessed the terrifying capacity to sever vital hydraulic lines, tragically incapacitate a waist gunner, or even more catastrophically, ignite a fuel tank, transforming the aircraft into an inferno. The acrid, unmistakable scent of cordite would insidiously permeate the flight deck, infiltrating through hundreds of minute punctures in the aircraft's structure. Despite this terrifying onslaught, there could be no deviation from the prescribed course. The crews were compelled to maintain their precise formation, steadfastly hold their altitude, and rigidly adhere to their heading, all while German predictive mechanisms calculated their impending demise with cold, mechanical exactitude. The inherent predictability of these bombing runs was proving to be a fatal vulnerability for the American air crews. Every bombardier, regardless of their individual skill, required identical conditions for a successful drop, a stable platform, a clear and unobstructed sight picture, and, crucially, an absence of any evasive maneuvers. Similarly, every pilot meticulously adhered to the same flight profile, precisely because these were the immutable demands stipulated in their training manuals. The Germans were acutely aware of this operational rigidity. Their discerning flak officers had diligently studied American tactics, meticulously timed the duration of bomb runs, and precisely measured the approach patterns utilized by the bomber formations. They possessed an intimate understanding that once a B-17 formation committed to its bombing run, it would steadfastly maintain constant parameters, typically at an altitude of exactly 25,000 feet, give or take a few hundred, and at an airspeed of approximately 180. This invaluable intelligence allowed their sophisticated predictors to be calibrated and set in advance, essentially pre-calculating the bomber's doom. By the spring of 1943, the bomber crews were engaged in a grim calculus, comparing the relative odds of survival. Fighter attacks, while undeniably terrifying in their ferocity, were typically brief and concentrated. A Focke-Wulf 190, for instance, would execute its attacking pass and then break away within a matter of mere seconds. Flak, on the other hand, was an impersonal yet utterly relentless adversary. It relentlessly followed the formation through the entirety of the target area, manifesting as an impenetrable curtain of steel that the crews were compelled to breach in order to fulfill their mission objectives. Some veteran crews recounted harrowing experiences of flying through barrage concentrations so incredibly dense that the individual explosions seemed to merge into a continuous roar, an unbroken, undulating wall of black smoke punctuated by vivid red-orange flashes. A formation caught within such a maelstrom had no recourse but to stoically endure the onslaught. The more seasoned airmen would impart sobering advice to newly arrived crews, emphasizing that one simply could not afford to dwell on the impending danger. They were instructed to strap in, resolutely point the nose of their aircraft towards the target, and fervently hope that their individual number was not inscribed upon one of those deadly shells. the established doctrine appeared utterly unyielding. Precision bombing, by its very definition, necessitated precision flying. Yet men were tragically perishing in those predictable, unwavering straight lines. And a growing unease began to stir among some pilots, prompting them to quietly question whether an alternative approach might exist. The very device that bestowed such devastating lethality upon German flak was housed within sturdy concrete bunkers adjacent to every gun battery, the Commando Garret 40. This mechanical computer, a marvel of engineering for its time, possessed the chilling capability to predict the future position of a bomber with an almost uncanny accuracy. This was not mere guesswork, nor was it the product of experienced gunners relying on intuition to eyeball the vast sky. This was mathematics made tangible, a sophisticated symphony of gears and cams performing ballistic calculations at a speed far surpassing any human crew's capacity. This intricate system represented the very zenith of fire control technology, and American bomber crews were tragically paying the ultimate price for its chilling precision. The intricate process commenced with the strategic positioning of optical rangefinders around each flak battery. These stereoscopic instruments, some boasting impressive base lengths of nearly 5 meters, possessed the remarkable ability to ascertain the precise distance to a target aircraft at altitudes reaching up to 40,000 feet. Highly trained operators meticulously tracked the bomber formations through their sophisticated optics, continuously feeding vital range data to the Commando Garret via electrical signals. Simultaneously, other dedicated operators diligently measured the target's azimuth and elevation angle. Thus, 3 crucial streams of data, range, bearing, and altitude, converged into the predictor mechanism every few seconds, painting an ever-updating picture of the bomber's trajectory. Within the intricate confines of the Commando Garret, a bewildering labyrinth of mechanical calculators sprang into action. This sophisticated device did not merely record the bomber's current position, it meticulously computed precisely where the bomber would be at the exact moment the shell reached its target altitude. An 88mm round, when discharged from an altitude of 25,000 feet, required approximately 30 seconds to ascend to its intended height. During this critical 30-second interval, a B-17, cruising at 180 mph, would traverse a distance of about 1.5 miles. The Commando Garret meticulously factored in this crucial variable, along with other environmental and ballistic considerations such as wind drift, air density, ambient temperature, and the specific ballistic characteristics inherent to the particular ammunition being fired. A complex interplay of cams and gears meshed seamlessly, performing intricate calculus through the elegant medium of mechanical analog computation. The precisely calculated output from the predictor was directly transmitted to the gun layers. Dials situated on each 88mm gun received a continuous stream of updated positional information, the requisite elevation angle, the appropriate traverse bearing, and, most critically, the precise fuse setting. German time fuses in 1943 could be set with an astonishing degree of accuracy, down to mere tenths of a second. The Commando Garret meticulously calculated the exact millisecond each shell needed to detonate in order to place its lethal fragmentation pattern precisely within the bomber's projected future position. Loaders, with practiced efficiency, would adjust the fuse rings according to the predictor's solution, and the gun would then discharge its deadly projectile. provided the bomber steadfastly maintained its course and speed. The intricate mathematics of the system proved to be flawlessly accurate. A German flak battery, expertly trained and operating at peak efficiency, possessed the terrifying capability to launch 6 rounds per gun into the aerial expanse every minute. A typical heavy flak battery comprised between 6 and 8 guns, all meticulously slaved to the same commando gyrate. This translates to an overwhelming barrage of 40 to 50 shells per minute, each one meticulously exploding in a precisely calculated position in the sky. The predictor would continuously update its solution as fresh tracking data streamed in, effectively walking the barrage along the bomber's projected flight path. The devastating consequence was a defined box of airspace, meticulously filled with lethal steel fragments, all timed to exist in the exact same coordinates as the approaching bomber formation. Crucially, this sophisticated system relied upon one fundamental prerequisite. It demanded predictable target behavior. The intricate calculations performed by the commando gyrate were predicated on the assumption that the target aircraft would steadfastly maintain its current velocity vector. Should a bomber suddenly alter its altitude or airspeed, the predictor's meticulously calculated solution would instantly become invalid. However, the Germans possessed an intimate understanding of American doctrine. They had meticulously captured and analyzed training manuals, extensively interrogated prisoners of war, and observed hundreds of bombing missions with painstaking detail. They knew, with chilling certainty, that once a B-17 formation stabilized onto its bomb run, it would maintain constant parameters for a critical period of 3 to 5 minutes. The commando gyrate was, therefore, specifically engineered to exploit this very predictability, turning American tactical rigidity into a fatal weakness. By the middle of 1943, the devastating effectiveness of this system was statistically quantifiable over heavily defended targets such as Bremen, Hamburg, and the vital industrial centers of the Ruhr. Flak batteries were achieving hit rates that would have been utterly impossible with manual gun-laying techniques. Post-mission damage assessments consistently revealed that the vast majority of bombers returning to England bore the unmistakable scars of flak damage, and, more tellingly, the shells were bursting at precisely the correct altitude. The fragments were not randomly distributed. They were arriving exactly where the predictors had calculated they should be. These mechanical brains were unequivocally winning the mathematical duel, and American crews, trapped by their own doctrine, possessed no immediate countermeasure. They were, in essence, flying by rigid doctrine directly into a sophisticated computational trap, and altering that doctrine seemed an insurmountable challenge. The Norden bomb sight, for all its precision, demanded stability, and stability was precisely what the commando gyrate needed to effectively destroy them. Something had to yield. Some fundamental change was imperative. Yet in the summer of 1943, no one could definitively articulate what that something might ultimately be. August 17th, 1943, irrevocably became the day that forced every established assumption into profound question. The audacious double strike against Schweinfurt and Regensburg, two absolutely critical centers for ball-bearing and aircraft production respectively, represented the deepest penetration into German airspace that the 8th Air Force had ever dared to attempt. The mission planners, though expecting significant losses, were utterly unprepared for the scale of what transpired over those heavily defended targets. The actual losses dramatically exceeded every grim projection. Of the 376 B-17s that bravely departed English airfields on that fateful morning, a staggering 60 never returned to base. An additional 168 aircraft limped back so severely damaged that many would never be deemed airworthy again. The overall casualty rate soared to an unsustainable 20%, a figure well beyond the sustainable threshold for any military operation. The flak encountered over Schweinfurt was of a magnitude and intensity unlike anything the crews had ever previously experienced. Gunners vividly reported barrage concentrations so incredibly dense that the individual explosions seemed to coalesce into a continuous, impenetrable black cloud. One pilot from the 381st Bomb Group described the terrifying experience of flying into what felt like a solid wall of smoke where individual bursts were indistinguishable, merely a churning, violent mass of shrapnel and concussive blast waves that tossed his massive aircraft around like a fragile leaf, caught in a tempest. The predictor-directed fire was devastatingly, chillingly accurate. Shells were consistently bursting at precisely 23,000 to 26,000 feet, the exact altitude band where the concentrated bomber stream was most vulnerable. The concentrated stream of enemy fire proved devastatingly effective. The casualties were far from random, aircraft adhering to the established bombing protocol, a steadfast, level flight at a consistent altitude and velocity, incurred the most severe damage. In particular, the lead bombardiers within each formation, compelled to maintain the most unswerving course for extended periods, suffered an exceptionally heavy toll. German strategists had astutely discerned the advantage of focusing their anti-aircraft fire on these formation leaders, recognizing that dismantling the lead aircraft would inevitably disperse the entire group's ordnance pattern. This indicated that the commandogerate predictors were being deployed with sophisticated tactical intelligence, transcending mere mechanical precision. Back at Bomber Command headquarters, the grim statistics reverberated with alarming intensity. General Frederick Anderson and his dedicated staff had always acknowledged that daylight precision bombing operations would be inherently costly. However, these newly compiled figures suggested that the entire strategic approach might be fundamentally untenable. Simple arithmetic vividly illustrated the impending disaster. If each deep penetration mission consistently resulted in a 20% loss rate, a crew's prospects of successfully completing a 25-mission tour plummeted to virtually zero. The crucial replacement pipeline was utterly incapable of matching the escalating demand. Furthermore, the specialized training facilities across the United States were already operating at maximum capacity, yet they could not produce new flight crews swiftly enough to offset this staggering rate of depletion. The second Schweinfurt raid, executed on October 14, 1943, unequivocally underscored the severity of the predicament. Infamously dubbed Black Thursday, this single operation exacted a further toll of 60 bombers lost, with an additional 17 sustaining such grievous damage that they were deemed irreparable. The 8th Air Force had dispatched 291 B-17s against the critical target, and by nightfall, a staggering 77 aircraft were gone, representing an unsustainable 26% loss rate. While the vital ball-bearing plants did sustain hits, the price paid was unacceptably exorbitant. We appreciate you staying with us and encourage you to watch the remainder of this video. We would be grateful for your like and subscription. Please also consider leaving a comment below, sharing where you are from, and what you think about the subject matter discussed. Following the devastating events of Black Thursday, deep penetration missions were interrupted indefinitely. The ambitious bomber offensive, which had been meticulously designed to pave the way for the D-Day landings, had been brought to a grinding halt by the formidable German defenses. Consequently, intelligence officers initiated rigorous post-mission interrogations, meticulously searching for any discernible pattern that might elucidate why certain aircraft survived while others did not. They scrupulously examined anti-aircraft artillery damage on returning bombers, noting precisely where shells had detonated in proximity to the airframe. They also conducted extensive interviews with pilots and bombardiers, inquiring about the exact moments when they observed the heaviest concentrations of enemy fire. Gradually, a pattern began to emerge, although it appeared initially paradoxical. Some flight crews reported that flak bursts seemed to be forecasting their trajectory, exploding slightly ahead of their current position, as if the German defenses possessed foreknowledge of their subsequent location. This, in fact, was precisely what was occurring. The commando turret was, of course, engineered to project shells into the bomber's future position, rather than its immediate one. Yet this particular observation ignited a pivotal inquiry in the minds of operational planners. What if the bomber was not in that predicted future position? What if the predictor's fundamental assumptions were circumvented or invalidated? Established doctrine explicitly forbade any deviation during the bomb run. The training manuals were unequivocal, stating that the entire theory of precision daylight bombing was predicated upon steadfastness. However, this unwavering adherence to stability was exacting a devastating human toll, leading some officers to question whether accuracy truly mattered if the crew did not survive to see the target. The profound crisis of August and October 1943 had fractured conventional thinking, and through that nascent fissure, innovation would eventually emerge. The initial deviations from established protocol did not originate in the strategic chambers of headquarters, but rather within the cockpits high over Germany. Veteran pilots, boasting 15 or 20 missions under their belts, began prioritizing their intuition above rigid instructional texts. Captain Robert Morgan of the 91st Bomb Group, who would later achieve renown for successfully completing his entire tour in the legendary Memphis Belle, commenced tentatively introducing minor alterations in altitude during his final approach to targets in late 1943. He was not outright defying orders. Rather, he was interpreting them with a degree of operational flexibility. His bombardier could still achieve adequate target acquisition imagery even if the aircraft ascended or descended a few hundred feet during the critical phase of the bomb run. Other crews also observed an anomalous effect when they implemented these unorthodox modifications. Lieutenant James McLaughlin, at the controls of a B-17 named Lucky Strike, recounted a remarkable occurrence over Bremen in November 1943 that would be debated in crew quarters for weeks afterward. His formation had steadied onto the bomb run at 24,000 feet, when intense anti-aircraft fire began enveloping their formation. McLaughlin instinctively pulled back on the yoke, reflexively applying upward pressure to the control column, thereby gaining approximately 400 feet over the subsequent minute. The flak bursts that had been dangerously close suddenly appeared below his aircraft. He had climbed into what should have been a heavier concentration of fire Yet the shells were detonating where he had been, not where he currently was. The explanation proved challenging to comprehend initially because it appeared to defy conventional logic. Every pilot's innate piloting wisdom dictated a descent away from Flak, urging them to get below it, utilizing gravity to accelerate out of the danger zone. Yet McLaughlin had ascended and the Flak had missed. Word of this spread rapidly through the 91st and neighboring groups. Some pilots attributed it merely to fortuitous coincidence, suggesting that perhaps the German gunners had simply adjusted their aim at that precise moment. However, others began experimenting, trying small altitude changes during their bomb runs, and carefully noting where the flak bursts appeared relative to their newly acquired position. Captain Charles Cruikshank of the 303rd Bomb Group undertook what could be described as empirical operational trials during missions in December 1943. He would brief his crew before each mission that he might depart from the prescribed flight level during the bomb run, and he specifically requested his bombardier to report whether it affected aiming accuracy. On 3 consecutive missions targeting locations in northwestern Germany, Cruikshank commenced gradual ascents of 500 to 800 feet, starting approximately 2 minutes before ordnance release. His bombardier reported that the Norden sight could compensate for the climb rate as long as it remained steady. More importantly, the flak that had been predicted for their original altitude invariably detonated beneath their current flight path. The underlying physics became comprehensible as aviators analytically processed the implications. Those formidable 88mm shells required approximately 30 seconds to reach their designated altitude. If a predictor calculated that an aircraft would be at 24,000 feet in 30 seconds, but the aircraft was actually climbing at 100 feet per minute, it would effectively be at 24,500 feet when the shells arrived at their preset altitude. This critical time of flight created a significant gap that altitude changes could strategically leverage. The commando juret was remarkably precise, but its computations were based on the bomber's current behavior. Alter that behavior, and the solution became obsolete, rendering its computations irrelevant. Initial reception was met with considerable skepticism. Operations officers articulated reservations regarding the cohesion of aerial formations, concerned that if individual pilots began climbing and descending at will, the tight defensive formations would inevitably disintegrate. Group commanders worried about bombing accuracy diminishing if bombardiers were compelled to work with unstable platforms. Some senior staff officers considered the entire concept as verging on outright defiance of authority, pilots getting creative when they should be strictly following established procedures. The doctrine had been developed by seasoned experts, rigorously tested at bombardier schools, and proven effective under operational conditions. One did not simply abandon such a deeply ingrained doctrine merely because a few pilots had novel theories. Yet those pilots consistently returned from sorties, while their less adaptable counterparts frequently did not. By January 1944, enough mission reports mentioned altitude variations and observed flak patterns that intelligence officers were compelled to acknowledge the discernible relationship. Crews that maintained unyielding adherence to prescribed flight levels seemed to take more hits than those that introduced variations. While this was not scientific proof, it was highly indicative. The data was anecdotal, disseminated throughout numerous operational summaries and crew accounts. Nevertheless, a clear pattern was emerging. The rigid, straight, and level approach that doctrine demanded might be exactly what the German predictors needed to achieve their deadly aim. Innovation born from sheer survival instinct was beginning to challenge the textbook, and the mounting evidence was getting harder to dismiss. The tactic that would ultimately save thousands of lives derived its designation from the very danger it ostensibly confronted: climbing into the flak. By early 1944, a sufficient number of crews had experimented with altitude changes that the mechanics of the technique began to coalesce into a discernible method. It was not about random evasive maneuvers or panicked, uncontrolled ascents. Instead, it represented a deliberate leveraging of the time gap between when German predictors finalized their calculations and when those calculations resulted in exploding shells at altitude. The most effective methodology involved a steady ascent of 500 to 1,000 feet during the final approach, commenced roughly 180 seconds prior to ordnance release. The timing of this maneuver was paramount. Initiate the climb prematurely, and the German tracking stations would simply feed the new data into their Kommandogerät, which would then adjust their computations for the bomber's altered flight path. Conversely, procrastinating the climb would leave the bombardier insufficient time to establish an unwavering aiming perspective before ordnance release. The optimal window appeared to be around the 2.5 to 3 minute mark. At that precise juncture, German predictors had already finalized their ballistic computations and begun transmitting fuse settings to the anti-aircraft guns. Loaders were meticulously setting time rings on shells based on calculations that erroneously assumed the bomber would still be at its original altitude. Those shells were, in many cases, already being forcibly loaded into the firing mechanisms. The crucial aspect of successfully navigating enemy airspace extended beyond mere trajectory, with the rate of ascent proving equally significant to precise timing. Initiating an overly aggressive pullback would inevitably jeopardize the cohesion of the aerial formation, simultaneously presenting the bombardier with a precarious base for precision targeting. Conversely, climbing too gently meant failing to achieve sufficient altitude to escape the predetermined detonation envelope of enemy ordnance. Seasoned pilots discovered that a steady climb rate, maintained consistently between 80 and 120 feet per minute, yielded the most efficacious results. At an ascent rate of 100 feet per minute, an aircraft would gain a substantial 300 feet in the 3 minutes preceding the release of bombs. A vertical displacement ample enough to position the bomber well above where the predictor-aimed shells were programmed to detonate, yet gentle enough to allow bombardiers to preserve their visual alignment for targeting and meticulously refine their ballistic computations. A poignant entry in Lieutenant William Cassiday's diary from the 384th Bomb Group recounted the harrowing occasion in February 1944, when his crew intentionally ascended into the anti-aircraft fire over Frankfurt. Having stabilized their trajectory for the bombing approach at 23,500 feet, the first explosions of anti-aircraft artillery manifested directly in their path. Defying established doctrine that mandated a constant altitude, Cassiday initiated a gradual ascent. His co-pilot expressed reservations regarding the maneuver, as they were visibly climbing toward the ominous dark plumes of detonating ordnance. Nevertheless, Cassiday steadfastly maintained his climb rate at approximately 90 feet per minute. Miraculously, the flak that had been bursting at their original altitude began appearing below them. They successfully released their bombs from an elevated position of 24,200 feet, and the entire formation experienced 0 casualties over the target. Every aircraft successfully made its way back to its home airfield, a testament to the effectiveness of this daring tactic. The underlying efficacy of this maneuver was rooted in an inherent constraint within the sophisticated German fire control system. While the Commando Garret was capable of calculating highly precise targeting computations, it possessed an inability to perform immediate, real-time adjustments. Once tracking data was fed into the predictor and a firing solution was generated, a critical delay of 20 to 30 seconds ensued before fresh intelligence could be assimilated and processed into a new solution. During this interim, shells with preset fuses were already loaded and fired. These shells were, by their design, destined to detonate at a specific altitude that had been calculated using outdated data. Consequently, if the target aircraft had altered its altitude during that processing and firing cycle, the shells would explode harmlessly in the void. An additional safeguard was furnished by the time-of-flight delay. An 88 mm shell, launched from ground level at a target positioned at 25,000 feet, typically had a flight duration of approximately 28 to 32 seconds, contingent upon prevailing atmospheric conditions. Within those 30 seconds, a B-17 ascending at 100 feet per minute would gain a significant 500 feet in elevation. The shell would thus arrive at the altitude where the predictor had calculated the bomber would be, but the bomber itself would actually be 500 feet higher. The resultant shrapnel dispersion from the burst would radiate in a conical shape beneath the aircraft, with the majority of deadly splinters traveling horizontally or downward from the point of detonation. Therefore, climbing effectively placed the aircraft above that lethal envelope. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Air crews began articulating their observations of this anti-aircraft occurrence in tangible imagery that elucidated the principle with striking clarity. They would witness shells bursting at what appeared to be their current altitude, only to realize these explosions marked their former spatial coordinates. One keen observer, a navigator, likened the experience to observing phantom footsteps ascending a staircase behind them, with each explosion marking where they had just been. Yet they were always one crucial step ahead. The mental consequence of this realization was profoundly impactful. Instead of passively enduring a relentless onslaught, pilots now felt they were proactively circumventing the German fire control system. They were, in essence, leveraging the system's own accuracy as its undoing. The Commando Garret continued to execute flawless computations, but it was calculating for an aircraft that had already departed from those specific geographical references. By March 1944, this innovative altitude change tactic had transitioned from isolated trials to established operational protocol at the divisional echelon. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 3rd Bomb Division, emerged as one of the first senior officers to officially sanction the method. Having meticulously reviewed mission reports and loss statistics, LeMay had forged his renown through pioneering strategic advancements. He was, after all, the architect of the combat box formation that afforded B-17's overlapping defensive fire. He possessed an astute ability to discern valuable on-the-ground ingenuity when he encountered it. His operations order, issued on March 12, 1944, consequently granted squadron commanders the authority to implement changes in elevation during bomb runs, accompanied by precise instructions regarding the duration and ascent velocities. The integration of this novel approach, however, encountered considerable opposition. Strictly conventional operational strategists argued vehemently that any departure from level flight would jeopardize the targeting accuracy that, in their view, validated the rationale for daytime aerial assaults in the first place. If American bombers were to endure substantial casualties by operating in daylight, in contrast to emulating the Royal Air Force's nocturnal bombardment strategy, then those losses absolutely had to yield exceptional targeting fidelity. Major Harold Bowman, stationed at 8th Bomber Command Headquarters, submitted a memo in early April, raising concerns that alterations in altitude might diminish the circular error probable, the radius within which bombs would fall, to intolerable thresholds. The memo petitioned for a provisional suspension of the tactic until rigorous evaluations could be performed at bombardier training facilities located in the United States. Nevertheless, the combat crews themselves had already resolved the contention through empirical evidence gleaned from direct engagement. Bombardiers reported that as long as the ascent rate remained steady and did not surpass 120 feet per minute, the Norden site's inherent gyroscopic stabilization and velocity adjustment apparatus could effectively counterbalance the movement. The bombardier would merely manipulate the designated rate controls to account for the climb, considering it an additional dynamic factor akin to wind drift or airspeed. Lieutenant Thomas Farabee, who would subsequently attain widespread recognition as the bombardier aboard the Enola Gay, flew multiple missions with the 384th Bomb Group, employing these climb techniques, and reliably delivered his ordnance within permissible boundaries of the target's designated central impact zone. Consequently, training protocols were rapidly revised to incorporate this successful innovation. New crews arriving in England during the spring of 1944 were thoroughly instructed on the altitude change technique as an integral component of conventional methodologies for approaching objectives. The directives were precise. Commence a steady climb 150 seconds before the projected release of ordnance. Maintain an ascent velocity between 80 and 110 feet per minute, and sustain that velocity uniformly to provide the bombardier with a stable and foreseeable base for targeting. Lead bombardiers, who bore the responsibility for dictating when entire formations would deploy their bombs, were granted supplementary discretion to modify the commencement moment of the climb based on discerned anti-aircraft trajectories and enemy targeting methodologies. The dissemination of this tactic across the 8th Air Force propagated naturally throughout the aerial bombardment formations themselves. Air crews would frequently observe adjacent units utilizing ascent maneuvers and subsequently perceive their diminished susceptibility to anti-aircraft harm during mission debriefings. Back at base, pilots would diligently exchange observations regarding effective and ineffective strategies. The 91st Bomb Group's experience over Brunswick on April 8, 1944, became a frequently cited case study. This group commenced an ascent from 24,000 to 25,200 feet during their bomb run, while nearby formations preserved their current elevation. The climbing group incurred minor anti-aircraft damage to 4 aircraft, none of which were critically affected. In stark contrast, the groups holding altitude suffered the loss of 3 bombers and sustained extensive harm to an additional 11 aircraft. Intelligence concerning such discrepancies disseminated with greater velocity than any formal directive could hope to achieve. Some groups independently conceived alternative approaches to the foundational method. The 3005th Bomb Group, for instance, trial-tested a maneuver involving both ascent and directional alteration, integrating an increase in elevation with a subtle modification of their flight path during the final minute before ordnance deployment. This effectively introduced a horizontal shift to complement the vertical movement, further exacerbating the complexity of enemy targeting computations. Other groups experimented with incremental ascents, intermittently holding altitude for 30 seconds, then rapidly climbing 200 feet, then holding again. However, the prevailing agreement indicated that a consistent, uninterrupted ascent proved most efficacious. The incremental ascents, or step climbs, inadvertently provided German tracking crews with discernible sequences for input into their targeting systems, whereas the steady climb presented dynamically fluctuating information that posed greater challenges for conversion into precise firing solutions. By May 1944, as readiness efforts for Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion, escalated, the altitude change technique had become established operational protocol across the majority of the 8th Air Force's bomb groups. Mission planning documents now incorporated designated ascent commencement points and desired target elevations. In the same manner, they delineated primary approach waypoints and ordnance deployment coordinates. New pilots, recently arrived from the United States, were instructed in the method during their inaugural familiarization sorties, even before flying their first combat mission. What had originated as an unsanctioned departure from established protocol had been formally integrated into the doctrine itself. The bomber force had undergone a tactical metamorphosis, adjusting to ensure continued viability against a fire control system that had been wreaking havoc upon aerial formations only a few months prior. This profound transformation occurred not as a result of top-tier strategic conceptualization, but rather through the collective wisdom of air crews who devised a means to overcome the lethal mathematical calculations of the enemy. The Germans were not oblivious to the developments unfolding in the skies above their homeland. By the summer of 1944, anti-aircraft battery officers communicated to their commanding officers that American bomber formations ceased adhering to foreseeable flight characteristics during bomb runs. Luftwaffe intelligence officers subsequently questioned detained B-17 airmen and, through these interrogations, ascertained details concerning the elevation alteration maneuvers that had become standard procedure. The critical inquiry then centered on the capacity of German anti-aircraft targeting mechanisms to sufficiently reconfigure themselves to counteract this progression in American tactics. The German Commander-Juret predictor crews diligently endeavored to implement various countermeasures in response to the evolving American aerial tactics. The most straightforward approach initially considered was to significantly increase the frequency of tracking updates. Instead of transmitting positional data to the mechanical predictor every 8 to 10 seconds, as was standard, operators attempted to accelerate this process, aiming for updates every 4 to 5 seconds. The theoretical underpinning of this strategy was sound. More frequent data inputs would theoretically enable the mechanical computing device to detect subtle altitude changes more swiftly and consequently recalculate precise firing solutions before the anti-aircraft shells were actually launched. However, in practical application, human operators found it exceedingly difficult to reliably sustain such a rapid pace. The arduous task of optically tracking a high-flying bomber at an altitude of 25,000 feet through rangefinders, while simultaneously calling out precise measurements every few seconds, inevitably led to profound fatigue and an increase in operational errors. As a direct consequence of this rushed execution, the overall quality and accuracy of the data being fed into the system significantly degraded. Beyond adjusting operational procedures, German engineers also delved into potential modifications of the commando turret itself. Certain anti-aircraft batteries were equipped with enhanced predictors, which incorporated additional calculating mechanisms specifically engineered to ascertain the bomber's rate of climb and integrate this crucial factor into the firing solutions. These upgraded units, officially designated as Commando turret 40Com-41, began to make their appearance at vital target defense locations, notably around Berlin and throughout the heavily industrialized Ruhr Valley, starting in mid-1944. While these technological improvements offered a marginal benefit, they ultimately proved incapable of overcoming the inherent and fundamental problem of time lag. Even with more sophisticated calculations, anti-aircraft shells still required a substantial 30 seconds to reach their operational altitude, during which period the American bombers could still gain approximately 500 feet. Although the predictor could estimate the climb rate, this estimate became immediately inaccurate if the bomber altered its climb rate or ceased its ascent altogether, effectively nullifying the advanced calculation. Another attempted resolution involved meticulously adjusting fuse settings to generate a more profound vertical burst pattern in the sky. Standard operational practice had previously dictated setting fuses for precise altitude detonation, which typically created a concentrated horizontal spread of fragmentation intended to hit aircraft flying on a level plane. German fuse technicians, however, began to experiment with staggered settings. Under this new protocol, some shells were fused to detonate precisely at the predicted altitude, others were set to explode 200 feet higher, and a third group was calibrated to detonate 400 feet higher. This innovative approach was designed to create a vertical ladder of explosions, specifically intended to bracket a climbing bomber regardless of its exact position within that vertical window. The 88mm batteries tasked with defending the critical Merseburg refineries employed this technique extensively during missions in September 1944. While this method undeniably increased the sheer volume of steel fragments and explosive force dispersed into the air, it simultaneously decreased the density of fragmentation at any single specific altitude, thereby paradoxically reducing the probability of a direct hit against individual aircraft. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of this video. We would be profoundly grateful for your like and subscription. Please also consider leaving a comment below, sharing where you are from and what your thoughts are on the compelling topic discussed in this video. The most effective German counterattack, surprisingly, was not technological in nature, but rather a procedural adaptation, initiating engagement at an earlier stage. Flak batteries began to open fire on approaching bomber formations from significantly greater distances, engaging targets approximately 8 to 10 miles from the objective instead of adhering to the previous practice of waiting until they were within 5 miles. This strategic shift compelled American pilots to commence their evasive altitude climbs much earlier in their approach, which in turn provided German tracking crews with an extended period to observe the altitude changes and feed updated data into their predictors. While some batteries did achieve improved accuracy with this method, particularly those defending heavily fortified targets, such as the synthetic oil plants at Leuna, this advantage came with its own set of drawbacks. Longer engagement ranges meant that the shells had to traverse through a greater expanse of atmosphere, which inevitably reduced their inherent accuracy and overall effectiveness, even when their fuse settings were precisely calibrated. German doctrine also underwent a paradigm shift, moving towards a strategy of barrage fire over predetermined zones rather than the precise tracking of individual aircraft. This represented a philosophical retreat from the sophisticated fire control systems that had initially rendered the commando juret so lethally effective. Instead of meticulously calculating precise intercept points for individual bombers, anti-aircraft batteries would now saturate expansive volumes of airspace, with shells set to varied altitudes and fuse settings. This technique, ominously nicknamed flak carpets by the American bomber crews, created dense, impenetrable fields of explosions that a formation was forced to navigate through, regardless of any evasive altitude changes. However, this approach consumed enormous quantities of ammunition and necessitated the deployment of larger concentrations of anti-aircraft guns, resources that Germany's rapidly deteriorating industrial capacity made increasingly arduous to provide. By the autumn of 1944, despite heavier gun concentrations defending critical targets, German flak effectiveness had demonstrably declined. Statistical analyses conducted by 8th Air Force Intelligence clearly indicated that bomber loss rates attributed to flak had plummeted from the catastrophic levels experienced in late 1943 to more sustainable figures. Missions that would have resulted in the loss of 20 aircraft in 1943 were, by this point, typically costing 8 or 10. It is important to acknowledge that the altitude change tactics were not the sole determinant in this reduction of German flak effectiveness. Other factors, such as augmented fighter escort, improved bomber formations, and a measurable degradation in German crew training, all contributed to the overall decline. Nevertheless, the tactical adaptation of climbing into the flak had unmistakably diminished the predictor system's efficacy. The commando juret remained a formidable weapon until the war's conclusion, particularly when American formations committed errors, or when mechanical failures compelled bombers to fly predictable paths. Yet it never again achieved the mathematical certainty and devastating precision it had possessed in 1943. The technological advantage held by the Germans had been effectively countered not by superior American technology, but by a cunning tactical adaptation. The bombers had not defeated the predictor system through advanced engineering. Rather, they had defeated it by refusing to behave in the predictable manner the system's designers had inherently assumed they would. The efficacy of climbing into the flak became quantifiable once a sufficient amount of mission data had been amassed for thorough analysis. Post-war studies, meticulously conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, carefully scrutinized loss rates both before and after the widespread adoption of these altitude change tactics. The accumulated data presented a clear and compelling narrative. Bombing missions executed in the first half of 1944, utilizing the innovative climb techniques, demonstrated a reduction in flak-related casualties of approximately 15 to 30% when compared to similar missions flown over comparable targets in late 1943. While the precise variance depended on the specific target defenses encountered and the proficiency with which formations executed their climbs, the statistical trend was undeniably unmistakable. Individual group records furnished even more granular and compelling evidence. The 100th bomb group, which had tragically earned the grim moniker Bloody Hundredth due to its devastating losses in 1943, witnessed a precipitous improvement in its casualty rates after formally implementing climb procedures in March 1944. Between March and August 1944, this group successfully flew 7 combat missions with a commendable loss rate of 3.2% per mission. While still inherently dangerous, this figure was dramatically below the unsustainable rates experienced during the preceding year. Their operations officer, Captain Robert Rosenthal, attributed a significant portion of this improvement to the combination of altitude tactics and enhanced fighter escort. Crews who survived the war from this particular group consistently cited the climb technique as a pivotal factor that afforded them a tangible fighting chance against the formidable predictor-directed anti-aircraft fire. The influence of this technique transcended mere immediate survival rates. It profoundly altered how bomber crews perceived their own vulnerability. In 1943, Flak had largely been regarded as an impersonal, unavoidable force, akin to enduring inclement weather. By mid-1944, however, crews gained a crucial understanding that they could actively counter this threat through precise and proper flying. This psychological shift held immense significance for morale. Pilots began to feel less like helpless targets and more like active participants in a tactical duel, where their actions could directly impact their fate. Training programs deliberately emphasized this newfound empowerment. New crews were taught that they were not simply flying bombers. They were operating within an intricate electronic and mechanical warfare environment where their strategic decisions had the potential to defeat sophisticated enemy systems. The enduring legacy of climbing into the flak extended well beyond the confines of World War II. Air Force tactical development officers meticulously studied the technique's profound success when formulating doctrine for bomber operations in subsequent conflicts. The fundamental principle that introducing unpredictability into flight parameters could effectively defeat prediction-based fire control became a cornerstone of modern evasive tactics. During the Korean War, B-29 crews confronting Soviet-designed radar-directed flak employed analogous variations of the altitude change technique. The underlying physics remained consistent, even though the predictors had evolved from complex mechanical calculators to early electronic systems. The advent of the jet age did not diminish the relevance of this crucial lesson. Strategic Air Command's B-52 crews during the Cold War underwent rigorous training on terrain-following penetration profiles, continuously varying their altitude to complicate Soviet surface-to-air missile calculations. While these missiles were considerably faster than 88mm shells and utilized electronic rather than mechanical guidance, the core principle enduringly persisted. Constant altitude was predictable, and predictability in this context was perilous. Contemporary terrain-following radar and automated flight control systems now embody the very same basic concept that B-17 pilots had empirically uncovered over the skies of Germany: the imperative to remain unpredictable within the operational parameters of one's mission requirements. Even in the current era of stealth technology and standoff weapons, the tactical DNA of climbing into the flak steadfastly survives. Modern strike planning heavily emphasizes varying ingress profiles, meticulously avoiding predictable flight paths, and introducing dynamic jinking maneuvers during terminal attack phases. While the specific methodologies have naturally evolved with technological advancements, the underlying logic remains fundamentally unchanged. Enemy fire control systems, whether they are antiquated mechanical predictors or sophisticated phased array radars, demand predictable target behavior to achieve optimal accuracy. Denying them that critical predictability directly and significantly degrades their overall effectiveness. The compelling story of B-17 pilots courageously climbing into the Flak represents something far more profound than a mere specific tactical innovation. It powerfully illustrates how military organizations adapt when established doctrine confronts the harsh realities of combat, and how, in such confrontations, reality ultimately prevails. The stark truth of the battlefield often dictates its own terms, ultimately triumphing over preconceived notions and established protocols. In the lead-up to and during the initial phases of the conflict, the formidable Army Air Forces had dedicated an immense volume of resources, both financial and human capital, to the meticulous development of its precision daylight bombing doctrine. This foundational strategy, designed to strike specific targets with unparalleled accuracy during daylight hours, had undergone a rigorous process of testing, continuous refinement, and careful codification within comprehensive training manuals. Consequently, it stood as the definitive, officially sanctioned and approved methodology for orchestrating and executing aerial combat operations, a testament to years of strategic planning and tactical preparation. However, a sobering reality soon emerged when the rigid application of this meticulously approved methodology began exacting a prohibitive toll, leading to the loss of aircrews at truly unsustainable rates. The organizational structure demonstrated a remarkable capacity for evolution. Rather than collapsing under the weight of mounting casualties, a crucial wave of innovation emerged organically from the operational front lines, originating with the very pilots and their crews. These frontline personnel, facing immediate threats, instinctively prioritized their direct, harrowing observations and empirical experiences over the dictates enshrined in their official training manuals. The successful adoption of these novel adaptations was not accidental. It flourished precisely because leadership, spanning various echelons of command, possessed the foresight and wisdom to recognize the undeniable validity of these field-developed innovations and actively facilitate their widespread dissemination throughout the force. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic General Curtis LeMay, alongside other influential commanders of the era, faced a critical juncture where they could have stringently insisted upon an unwavering commitment to established doctrine, potentially resorting to severe disciplinary measures, such as court-martialing pilots who dared to deviate from the approved procedures. However, in a display of exceptional strategic acumen, they chose a different path. Instead of punitive enforcement, these leaders meticulously scrutinized the empirical data gleaned from combat missions, carefully recognizing and validating the efficacy of these new, unconventional approaches. They then proceeded to formalize and institutionalize what was demonstrably working. This profound organizational flexibility, characterized by an open willingness to learn directly from the insights and experiences of the personnel actually engaged in the brutal realities of combat, arguably proved to be a factor as profoundly significant as the tactical innovation itself. Ultimately, these courageous aircrews, under immense pressure, succeeded in devising a viable method for their own self-preservation. Crucially, the command structure proved prescient enough to permit and even embrace this deviation. Consequently, countless thousands of airmen returned home safely from the harrowing theaters of World War II because astute observation and daring experimentation revealed that ascending dynamically toward the exploding anti-aircraft shells made far more strategic sense than passively maintaining a fixed altitude within the enemy's precisely calculated kill zone. Theoretical mathematical models had emphatically proclaimed such a maneuver to be impossible, and the established doctrine rigorously deemed it entirely wrong. Yet, the living proof provided by the survivors themselves attested unequivocally to its effectiveness. This profound insight stands as an enduring lesson. Sometimes the authoritative manual, despite its careful construction, is simply incorrect. And in the face of existential threats, the imperative for survival often compels ingenuity and innovation, utterly irrespective of what the formally approved procedures might dictate.